this is a past paper question, and what we can see here is a table, right? And in this table we can see different activities A, B, C, D, E, F, right, and so on. And for each activity, the number of weeks that activity is going to take place to complete, right? So the duration, for example, of activity A is 1 week, activity B is going to take 1 week to complete, so on and so forth. Okay, what we can see here is that there is no dependence shown. So it is not stated whether activity B is dependent on activity A or not, right? From this table we cannot draw that conclusion, but you can, worst case scenario is you're going to have to make some assumptions. For example, I've already covered this in previous videos, that the design phase cannot begin until you've gathered requirements from the users. So activity B cannot start until activity A is complete. Similarly, after you're done with the designing of after you've produced the design, right, you're done with the flow charts, you've broken, you've decided on what modules are going to be implemented, right, so on and so forth, right? After that, activity C can start, which is related to programming, right, coding. And module testing can take place in parallel with program coding, right? So if you've developed some modules, you can test them whilst the other modules are still being coded, right? So as soon as a module gets completed, you can start testing it, and the programmer can move on to the remaining modules that need to be programmed. So C and D can take place in parallel. Integration testing can only take place after all the modules have been coded, right? So after C is complete, after D is complete, only then integration testing can be done, right? In this, all the modules are packaged together and the entire program is tested, whether all the modules are working fine, right, when they are working together as one complete software. And then alpha testing can take place after integration testing is complete, right? And the installation of software and acceptance testing, once again this cannot take place because this has to take place at the client's end, right? So this cannot take place until alpha testing and integration testing, which is done in-house, right, which is done in the software in the software at the software company's office, right? So until this part is complete, you can't go for activity G, right? Activity G, obviously, after activity G comes activity H, right? As far as researching and ordering hardware is concerned, that can be done at any stage, that is not dependent on coding or module testing or anything. So this can be done virtually at any stage, right? And after you've ordered hardware, only then you will be delivered hardware. So J cannot start before H, J can only start after H, right? And as soon as you have received the hardware, you can deliver it, right? Then comes activity K, writing technical documentation. This can be done parallel with, for example, module testing or integration testing, right? So this is where you have to produce technical documentation. Some typing needs to be done, things related to how the software works, and what kind of what this actually, well, I should not say how the software works. This actually includes details related to a programmer. For example, what would help the programmer, the annotations. For example, such and such module is carrying out such and such functionality, we are using such and such variables for such purposes, right? So technical documentation is basically for the programmer's own help, right? So if the programmer visits this piece of code later on, for example, a month from now or 2 months from now, he's going to take a look at the technical documentation and see what different modules I have, what are those modules doing, what are the different variables that I'm using. So technical documentation is related to that. So this can be done after you have written your program code, right? So this can be done in parallel with C, right? And likewise, user training guide can be written after you have, for example, after you've done your alpha testing, right? So this can be done in parallel with for example this, right? So there's no strict guideline as such, as to when this can be done. This can be done at any stage, right? And after this, you've done this, after you've written your user training guide, after that the users can be trained, and after the users can be trained, the users can now start using the system, and start inputting data and start maintaining their software, right? And this is the final stage, the sign off stage. Okay, so this is the worst case scenario where we have to understand on our own the relationship between activities. Generally he's going to give you some hint, and this is the Gantt chart that he has provided in the question. So he's already given us a lot of hints. For example, he's telling us here that activity A, once activity A is complete, then activity B starts. Once activity B is complete, then activity C starts. And activity D, which is basically related to module testing, can take place in parallel with activity C. Activity E is going to start after activity D has finished, and activity E, I believe, is integration testing, right? And after integration testing has finished, completed, then we can do alpha testing, which is what? Which is activity F, as you can see here, right? So activity F is alpha testing, activity E was integration testing. So in the Gantt chart, he has shown us the dependencies, right? So actually we didn't so in this case, we don't have the worst case scenario. In this case, the Gantt chart itself is showing dependencies, right? And this has been provided in the exam, so after activity F is over, which is alpha testing, right, we can install the software at the client's end and do some acceptance testing. This is where the client gives you feedback on how good the software is working. And we can see activity H, which is related to ordering hardware, research and ordering hardware. This can be done at any stage, right? So he's shown that this started at the end of week 2, right, at the start of week 3, right? So this is what? This is week 3. This is week 3 when they started. It took a week, right? So it took 1 week to finish. And after activity H, activity J was related to installation of delivered hardware. This started after activity H, and it took 3 weeks to complete, right? And activity K was related to technical documentation, and it started in week 11, and it took 4 weeks to complete, right? So week 11, week 12, week 13 and week 14, right? And activity L, which was related to writing user training guide, started at the end of activity K, right? Or you could also think that it started at the end of alpha testing, right, which was done in house, right? So this lasted for 2 weeks. Now activity M and activity N have not been shown on the Gantt chart, right? So these are not present on the Gantt chart. Activity M is related to training users, and training users can only take place after we've written the user training guide, and training users is going to be 1 week long. So the duration is 1 week long. So activity M can begin at the end of activity L, and activity M is going to take 1 week, which means that we have to show this on the Gantt chart, right? We have to complete this Gantt chart. So we have to complete activity M. It's going to start after activity L has ended, and it's going to be 1 week long. So we are going to shade this box completely. Just like the other boxes have been shaded, we need to shade this box to show that activity M is going to take 1 week long. So this is where we are training the users, right? Once activity M has been completed, we are going to start activity N, which is basically what? We are going to hand over the system. The users can start inputting data into the system, and they can start using the system for their use, right? this is where the training has ended, and you finally handed over the system to your client, and his office has started using this system. Okay, so activity N is going to start at the end of the training, which was activity M, right? And this is going to be 1 week long. So we need to add this information to the Gantt chart also. So activity N is going to take 1 week, right? And that's our complete Gantt chart, right? So we've solved one part, we've completed the Gantt chart from the given table. Then the next question says state the earliest completion date of the project, and we can see here that it's going to finish here, right? This is the last activity that is taking place, right? So this is the point where it where this ends. So this is going to end in week number 18, right? Then part B says there are problems with the progress of the project. Okay, so whilst the project was going on, some problems occurred, and let's take a look at what the problems were. Activity E showed that the code contained major errors. So activity E was related to integration testing. When we integrated all the modules and we tested the software, it showed that there were some errors in the code, right? So the senior programmer has now estimated, or the project manager has now estimated, that further module coding will require another 2 weeks. Which means what? Which means that the errors that were found in the code now need to be fixed, and that is going to take another 2 weeks. Which basically means what? Once we are going to rewrite our code, we are going to retest. We'll have to do module testing once again, and we'll have to once again integrate the code and test it once again. So basically, from coding onwards, which is going to take 2 weeks, we'll have to perform module testing also. So module testing can take place in parallel with coding, right? So once we are done with module testing, and once we are done with coding, then we can do integration testing. We'll package all the modules together, and then we'll test it once again. So these 3 things right here need to be done again. Okay. And he has also specified the timeline for these, how much each activity is going to take. Okay, so just so you know that this is integration testing. This is the point where we discovered that there was an error in the code, and this is related to coding, right? Activity C is related to coding. So now that we've discovered an error at this stage, we need to start writing our code once again, and these modifications, removal of errors, is going to take another 2 weeks. And remember that coding was related to module C. Okay, and then module D was related to module testing, right? So activity D was related to module testing, and activity E was related to integration testing. So these 3 activities need to be done once again. However, the time for writing module code this time is going to be 2 weeks, right? Because that is what is being said here. Further module coding will require another 2 weeks. So basically, at the end of integration testing, this is where we discovered the errors. At this point, we need to go back to coding. So from here on, for 2 weeks, we are going to code some more, right? So we are going to code for 2 weeks, and during this time we can do module testing in parallel, right? Just as we were doing activity C here, and we were doing module testing in parallel, right? We can do module testing in parallel as we are writing our code once again, right? So 2 weeks for writing code and 2 weeks for module testing, and there is going to be an overlap, right? Just like there is an overlap here also, right, between C and D. Okay, once we are done with coding and once we are done with module testing, then we can go for integration testing, which is going to require another 2 weeks. As you can see here from the diagram, in this case, once the module testing was over, then the integration testing had started, right? And now in this case, once we have coded and fixed the errors, we've done module testing. Now the integration testing is going to start once again, and this is going to require 2 weeks. So we have what we have done is we have fixed this part of the Gantt chart, right? So this was the initial idea, right, in gray, but what we are doing now in red is the actual progress, right? So this is what's happening right now. Okay, then he has specified another problem. He says that the hardware delivery has been delayed by 16 weeks. Okay, so this is the original table, and we can see that activity J is related to delivery of hardware and its installation, right? So this has been delayed by 16 weeks, and remember this activity is going to take 3 weeks, right? So it has been delayed by 16 weeks and it's going to take 3 weeks. So originally in part A, where we filled up activity M and N, this activity J was going to take place in the 4th week. You can see here, right, at the end of the 3rd week and the start of the 4th week. This has now been delayed by 16 weeks, right? So activity J, which was initially going to as planned was going to happen here, right, at the start of week 4, has been delayed by 16, right? So 4 plus 16 is what? 20, right? So this is where activity J is going to take place, and it's going to take 3 days, right? So this was where it was planned, basically, right? This was where it was planned for these 3 weeks, but it got delayed so by 16 weeks. So we've drawn it here, right? We've filled up, we've shaded the 3 weeks. Now from this table we can see that after we have installed hardware, only after that would it be possible for us to install software and carry out acceptance testing, and acceptance testing is done at the client's end, right, at the client's office. So activity G can only take place after activity J has finished, which means what? Which means that once activity J has finished, after that activity G is going to take another 2 weeks. So after activity J has finished, right, activity G is going to take another 2 weeks. Okay, so now we have to figure out activity K, right? And activity K is related to writing technical documentation, right? And this takes 4 weeks. Okay, so where are we going to fit activity K? Okay, for this what we can do is we can take a look at the Gantt chart that we solved earlier in part A, right? And we can see where activity K was filled up, in the initial Gantt chart, and this was what we had solved earlier, right? And in this we can see that activity K is here, right? So this is activity K, and it can start at the end of this activity, which is what? Which is related to module testing, right? Which is related to module testing. So activity D could start, activity K could start at the end of activity D, right? So this is what we've learned from the Gantt chart that was given to us in part A, right? Part A that we solved earlier. So what we can do here is we can take a look at where our activity D is completing, and this is the point where activity D is completing. So we can actually start activity K from this point, and we can go on for 4 weeks because that's how long this activity takes, right? Then comes activity L. Okay, as we can see here that activity L is related to writing a user training guide. So this can pretty much take place at any time, right? However, activity M is basically when we start training the users, right? So activity L must take place before activity M, and activity M is related to training the users. Okay, let's go back to our Gantt chart and see if we can make some conclusion about, for example, when activity M can be started. Alright, so what we can see here is that this is the point to which this project has been delayed, right? So activity G, which was related to installing software and acceptance testing, right? So this is kind of the most delayed activity on our Gantt chart, right? Which basically means what? We can't start training users until activity G has completed, because we had to install software and carry out acceptance testing, and completing activity G, installing software and taking acceptance testing from the client, right, brought us to this week, right? Week number 24, right? Okay, so now if we want to train the users, it cannot happen before this point, right? So activity M cannot happen before this point. It can only happen after activity G has been completed, because this was kind of the last activity, right? The most delayed activity so far. So activity M takes 1 week, and then signing off of the final system takes 1 week, right? Alright, so activity M 1 week, activity N 1 week, right? So going back, first we are going to shade this up, right? Activity M is going to take 1 week, and then activity N is going to take 1 week. Okay, so we know this is where the project is going to end, and we have not filled in activity L, right? Now activity L, which is related to writing writing what? Writing user training manual, right? The user training guide. Yes, activity L is related to user training guide, and it is 2 weeks long, right? So this must take place before activity M. Okay, so so basically on our Gantt chart, this is the last activity that we are filling in, right? And we were able to figure out where M and N were going to take place, and we know that before we train the users, we must have the training guide complete. Therefore, what we are going to do is we're going to go back to our Gantt chart, and this is the point from where we can go backwards and complete activity L in these 2 weeks. Okay, and finally he's asking us the new estimated completion date, right? And that would be what? That would be week 26, right? So it's going to be week 26. It's going to end in week 26.